Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here at Georgetown this afternoon. Thank you to Georgetown for organizing this event, and what a lovely opening session we had upstairs just a short while ago. I thought that was very, very substantive and very touching, given Ambassador Schaefer's remarks at the end. We are here for a panel about how the Indian diaspora here in the US shapes US-India relations. And we're going to discuss that over a range of topics with my very accomplished panelists over here, who I'll introduce in just one second. Just very quickly, my name is Sanjeev Joshipur. I work in Diaspora. We are a nonprofit organization that deals with the Indian diaspora, and we are a network of people who want to do good in many different realms. So we work extensively on US-India relations, and now also with trilaterals incorporating third countries that are of strategic importance to the US and India. We help increase the visibility of the Indian diaspora here in the US in a nonpartisan way in sociopolitics. And we are a philanthropic catalyst for Indian Americans here in the US and from the US to India as well. Just a brief introduction of my panelists, and I'll sort of go in the order that I'm going to call upon them. Suchit Bachalli is to the extreme left. Suchit is the CEO of Unilog, a global technology company which specializes in e-commerce solutions and enriched product data for the B2B marketplace. He brings over 15 years of technology sales and management experience with a particular focus on wholesale distribution, retail, and online commerce. He was selected by the Philadelphia Business Journal as a 40 under 40 honoree, an award which recognizes the region's most accomplished young business leaders. Then to my immediate left is Balan Iyer. Forgive me here for reading because, frankly, no, I was just going to say, Balan, that whatever I read about all of you is not going to do justice to your level of accomplishments, but nonetheless, just by way of introduction. Balan Iyer is the founder and CEO of Percipient.ai, an artificial intelligence firm based in Silicon Valley, focused on the most challenging intelligence and national security missions. He's the previous CEO of a $100 million IT firm and a commanding general of a joint interagency task force in combat in Afghanistan. And then in between is Maya Ajmera. Maya is the president and CEO of the Society for Science and the Public. Excuse me. She is an alumna of the organization's most prestigious competition, the Science Talent Search. In 2013 and 2014, Maya served as the inaugural social entrepreneur in residence for Duke University. And in 1993, she founded the Global Fund for Children, GFC for short, a nonprofit organization that invests in innovative, community-based organizations working with some of the world's most vulnerable children and youth. So thank you all for being here. And thank you, Maya. I know you're in DC, but thank you very much for making the time on a Saturday for this. And thank you, Suchit, for coming from Philly. And Balan, to you as well, because I know you split your time between the Bay Area and over here. So thanks for being here. So just some very brief remarks to set the stage before I turn it over to the panelists. Like I said, we're going to talk about how the evolution of the Indian diaspora has influenced US-India relations and how they will continue to do so over time. One thought that comes to my mind as I begin the conversation is looking at a couple of other diasporas here in this country that have not only done well for themselves, but have played an obvious role in influencing relations between the United States and their original home countries, or their parents' home countries, as the case may be. And I'm referring specifically to the Jewish American diaspora here and the Irish Americans. As we know, relations between Ireland and the United States are very strong. There's plenty of Irish people here. On St. Patrick's Day, you can see so many people who are Irish or not dressed in green. I've lived in Chicago for several years. I know that the Chicago River turns green on St. Patrick's Day. The Irish Taoiseach, as they call him, the Prime Minister there, who, by the way, happens to be of Indian origin, Leo Varadkar, is regularly in the United States, on St. Patrick's Day. The Jewish American community here, needs sort of no introduction, really. Just one example of their influence in many, many different realms, by the way. But just one example in the space of politics is that among the American population at large, I think Jewish Americans are roughly 2%, give or take, but the number of members of Congress is 10% for Jewish Americans. And that's just one example among many, many different realms of activity, whether it's corporate, the arts, what have you, academics, where Jewish Americans play a very influential role in our society. And, I don't think it's fair to say that in terms of our social influence, Indian Americans are quite at that point yet, although the Indian diaspora has certainly played a very significant role in certain fields such as technology, medicine, and so on and so forth. But with that said, let me open the conversation. Suchit, let me turn to you first. When we were having a sort of a pre-talk before this panel, you had mentioned how you are among the younger wave of Indian immigrants who have come to the US and successfully built entrepreneurial companies here in America, quite different from, let's say, the typical people in Silicon Valley in the past who, let's say, have now built very successful companies but would have emigrated here in the 60s or the 70s. What I'd like to ask you, Suchit, as one of the new wave entrepreneurs, now certainly your company is much, much, much more than a startup, but initially when you started out as an entrepreneur, how has the typical Indian American's attitude and involvement in the entrepreneurial space changed over time as you have seen it from the past to the present day? And how does that, also I'd like to add on here quickly, how does that influence, do you think, US-India relations in terms of, with more Indian entrepreneurs being here in the US, what that means for collaboration with India in the private sector and just in terms of people-to-people collaboration?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm part of another nonprofit called TIE, which is the Indus Entrepreneurs, a large global nonprofit for entrepreneurship in the US and primarily founded by Indian Americans. And when I go to TIE meetings, none of those stories really resonate with me in terms of their lives and their journeys, because a lot of them, either their parents had immigrated here in the 60s, 70s, or they had come in here for education. And when I look back on my journey, when I moved residence here, I was 36. I had a 2-year-old daughter, and it was more of a conscious choice that was driven by market conditions, not so much, aspirational needs. So I think from that perspective, when we look at how things have changed, I think a lot of Indian entrepreneurs, a lot of Indian businesses are looking at the US as an influential market, as a market leader in terms of economy. I mean, California in and of itself is probably the 5th largest economy in the world. So from an economy perspective, this is a large economy, and so my motivation was really to come in and establish a business that was already built in India. So we had built the business in India for a while, was doing really well, but a lot of our customers were here, and so I moved the headquarters to the greater Philadelphia area. So when I look back and sort of look at other stories just within my family, right? Two of my uncles are doctors here. My great uncle taught at Princeton. I have the distinct honor of being the only person that did not finish college in my family.
Now you're addressing folks here at Georgetown.
So when I look back, their stories are very different. It was a lot to do with education. It was a lot to do with coming here for higher education and then building a career. A lot of professionals that came over in waves, during the 70s and the 80s, and that was because you could argue that there was a lack of opportunity in India. In my generation and in the generation right behind me, when I talk to younger people, it's not really an opportunity question anymore, right? So it's not about, can I put my tasks, skills, can I put my skills to work in India? I think that's a non-issue. It's more about having a choice and making that choice between Canada, between America, between Australia, and so the new global Indian looks and thinks very differently from a few years ago.
And so I think what that means, I guess, Suchit, is that to the extent that Indian entrepreneurs, for example, still want to come to America and do business with America, speaks to two things. One, the ability of America to compete in the global marketplace for talent. But secondly, perhaps the Indian affinity, not at a, we heard, on the floor above about governmental relations and the hesitations of history. But on a people-to-people basis, U.S.-India relations have always been strong, and that continues. And to the extent that some Indians still want to come here and study and work and start up their own organizations, speaks to that, although there is significant competition, as you mentioned, in terms of other countries attracting Indian talent as well. One more thing that I'd like to talk to you about, Suchit, before we turn it over to our next panelist, Balan. You have worked in the entrepreneurial space, as you just mentioned, obviously here in America, but also in India. What are, in your perception, the similarities and differences between entrepreneurial culture and execution between, let's say, your typical Indian entrepreneur and your typical Indian American entrepreneur? Or are there any?
Sure. So I heard the words upstairs, shared values, right? So very quick story. When I came to the US was when I was 19, and I was part of a youth camp. So it was an cultural exchange. And my first sort of dinner was at a family where I was staying with my host mom and the host parents, and they put together this great dinner, sit-down dinner for the whole neighborhood, and everyone came, and I was 19. And we sit down, and this is in Alabama, by the way. So we sit down, and she says, "Suchit, would you like to say grace?" And I'm 19, and I'm like, I kind of don't understand what that means. But when I was in boarding school, we all prayed before eating a meal. So I guess I thought maybe this is the same thing, and I didn't want to say no because I thought they might send me back. So we sit down, and I said, let's hold hands. So there's 20, what do you call them, Alabamians holding hands. And I proceeded to speak in Hindi, like just, gibberish, I guess. But every 30 seconds, I dropped the word Jesus. And this was the longest 60 seconds of my life. And here I'm in a Jesuit school talking about this story. But then we end, and my host mom looked at me and she said, "That was very profound." And then she looked at everyone and she said, "Isn't it amazing that the name of our Lord is the same in every country?" And I said, so from a shared values perspective, I think if a 19-year-old kid can get away with that, and I see that same sort of string of coincidences or similarities between the Indian culture in business and American culture in business. And I know we've sort of, in India, we have this notion of jugaad, and we have institutionalized it, but it's
frugal innovation.
Exactly, but it's no different from what I see within American entrepreneurs and the creativity that they bring to the table. I teach every year entrepreneurship at a high school, and I see high school kids, and they all we teach them how to structure entrepreneurship, and they all have this critical moment where they pivot their business, right? So they go out, they come into this program with a particular idea, and then 3 months of market research and talking to customers, they kind of realize, we got to make some change. We got to have that pivot to actually address the market. And I find that exactly how Indian businesses operate, and even to this day. And I think the culture of innovation, the culture of allowing ideas to come to fore has always been very similar. And the last thing I would say, I think, in the private sector and in America, I think there is a sense of meritocracy that exists even in the private sector, and we all know of our parents or our uncles who worked in private sector and did well regardless of the fact that they didn't have family money or whatever, but it's a meritocracy. So I think there's a lot of commonality, and that's something that we should continue to grow.
Suchit, there was a lot of substance in your answer, but the main thing I take away from you is that even at 19, you had entrepreneurial flair. Know your customer. Let me turn it over to our next distinguished panelist, Balan. Balan, I certainly do want to talk to you about entrepreneurship because you definitely are sort of well entrenched and getting more so in that space. But I also want to broaden out the conversation a little bit to another area, which is the policy area, which ties in to a little bit to some of what Rich and Tom and Irfan and Tezi were talking about upstairs. I know this is an area in which you have experience in terms of legislative, contacts, connections, advocacy, conversations, and so forth, given your past life in the military as well, and thank you for your service, Balan. How has the Indian diaspora been working to influence policy towards India and the legislative outlook towards India? I want to focus on the legislative branch because I think the executive branch, Balan, as you know, just based on reading, the Times of India or the New York Times or what have you, is well documented in terms of what the Secretary of State said or what the Indian Foreign Minister said, but the legislative branch not so much here in the U.S. So, what is it that you think the Indian diaspora has done well in terms of talking to the U.S. legislative branch about India, and what is it that you think they can do differently moving forward?
Well, thank you. You've already touched on some things I'd like to offer a few thoughts on. It does strike me, first of all, what a great story. I do think that the world is changing. Like many of the earlier immigrants from India, scarcity of opportunity is what brought my dad here in 1954. And, I was thinking back, listening to Rich talk about the way that the relationship has changed. And I do think that there is a distinction between people who choose to come to the United States now for opportunity, or they think they can grow a little faster, and those that came because of scarcity of opportunity. But I do think, and the thing that I would just share with you across the subjects you've mentioned already that I think is just so important, and it's what in diaspora I think really aspires to be, and I worry a little bit about the comparisons you mentioned with the Jewish American and Irish American community. I think that it lessens what we should be aiming at as a diaspora. It strikes me that the core values of Vedanta, and of course the values that this nation is founded upon, are so universal. And the expression of those values, kind of meritorious performance that are so natural to Indian American families and so natural to Indian families, this is the stuff of great nations. And sometimes when Rich was the ambassador and I was in India, the last Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce were visiting, I was reminded that, gosh, how far we've come. 23, 24 years ago, I landed in India as the first American of any of the services in the Indian Armed Forces to have an American Air Force pilot. I was training Indian Air Force pilots on exchange with India, and we were still in very much a kind of a Cold War mentality. I was being followed around. My conversations were being listened to. As my cousins were Indian Air Force pilots, they'd call me and say, "Balan, they're taping your phone calls." And I was like, well, it's only a couple of phone calls I'd be worried about, one with my wife and the other with my mom. But they just didn't understand that what I knew then and what I'm so pleased to have seen transpire is that it's inevitable that the coming centuries are Indian centuries and American centuries. And it's not because of our ability to compete and win in the global marketplace, although economic strength is very important. It's much more about the values. It's much more about the expression of service and compassion and love and things that are universal in the faiths that are celebrated in India. By the way, you weren't far off. Where my family's from in Chennai, one of the apostles of Lord Jesus rests. And of course, if you see the Catholicism that's practiced there, it's unlike anywhere else in the world. You might think that you're going back 2,000 years in time. very few civilizations were able to make it across the Deccan Plateau south in India. And so it's just spectacular, the celebration of faith and what that faith and values means to people in India and in South Asia. I think you find the same at the core of the American experience as well. And so I can't tell you how optimistic I am about the future of our countries. And I think it goes beyond the fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump or President Obama got along. It's much deeper than that. It's about what we believe, and it's about the notion that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, and that these core values of that nation, of the Indian nation and of the American nation, are so similar, not just in the forms of government, but in the expression of what great citizenry is about. I was interviewed by a couple of brilliant Georgetown students earlier, and I mentioned to them that it's a real mess in this entrepreneurial business. You know, the Indian Americans, I'll be at TIE here next week. On May 4th, they're announcing our company is nominated for one of their awards. And, you know, what are they really celebrating? Entrepreneurship. Is it really the pursuit of kind of material achievement that we're celebrating? It's really not. That's a bit of a head fake, right? It's about the kind of the ability to kind of see a problem and to believe so firmly in your heart that when you bring the right technologies and people together, you could solve that problem. In the end, if you're the best at anything in the world, you can find a way to monetize it. What we're really celebrating with entrepreneurship in America, and I think in the Indian diaspora, is this notion of courage, of faith, of resilience, of the belief that something that everyone thought was impossible 10 years ago could be accomplished now. And all of those values come out both of the American experience and Indian experience. So it seems to me appropriate that entrepreneurship is one of the things that's led the rise of the Indian diaspora, but it won't be the thing that defines us. It'll be the philanthropy. It'll be the willingness of Indian American leaders not to just be rich, but to find a way to make a difference in their community. And not because they're trying to show off their wealth or because there's but because they understand their character is what, in the end, the life's journey is all about. And so, you know, as I told those Georgetown students, I think the end of your education has to be character. And I think what will make the Indian diaspora powerful in its impact on the American experience is its ability to resonate with those values that are core to the American experience. And so I really think the philanthropic goals that Indian diaspora has, the willingness of us, not because we're Indian American, but because we know it's right to serve others. And then let that be the reflection of our heritage. I think that's where the real power of our experience will come from. You can't shake a stick in Silicon Valley without hitting an Indian millionaire. There's nothing, you know, and all of them are searching for influence. All of them are searching for something that, because they haven't spent time on developing their character, and they're looking for some way to give back. I'm okay with building temples. That's okay. There's lots of people who want to build temples. To me, it's less meaningful than coming out into your community and helping people who are in need or suffering, or not that they're Indian. Though Indian temples, gurdwaras in particular, are terrific at this service to the community. I think many Indian temples have wonderful service communities. But I really think the secret to our success will not be in modeling after the Jewish or Irish American, which came in different waves in the American experience. I think our purpose now is to really live out kind of the core teachings of the great faith, and that would be the influence that India as a nation and Indian Americans in America will be very proud of.
You know, Balan, your point about philanthropy is appositely made here in America because I think it's documented across various countries that in terms of private individual philanthropy, Americans do give a lot. Obviously, I'm talking about Americans at large, not just Indian Americans, but Americans at large. So it's apposite that you're talking about individual philanthropy here, in America. But if I could draw you back just for 1 minute to the legislative branch question in terms of what you think, Balan, based on your experience, your connections in the U.S. Senate and so forth, what is it that you think that the diaspora can do better in terms of influencing legislative outlook towards India?
Well, now that's very tactical, but I do think that, as I heard Ambassador Verma and others talk about, that the core relationships between our 4 million strong diaspora and their families and extended families in India, and the business and other professional elements of connection between our nations will drive, I think, a pro-growth, a pro-business, a pro-education connection with India. You know, I think it's entirely right that India wants to develop strategic indigenous industry and has a Make in India. I think it's terrific. America was the same way when we were at that point in our democracy. Now, we've got to balance that out with the notion that India wants access to markets and free trade where it benefits India. And these are just the tough decisions that nations have to make. But I think if you have that negotiation in the context that it's inevitable that the coming centuries belong to the great free nations that respect humanity and have a sense of equality and have a sense of kind of love and compassion in the way that they deal with their elderly and their children especially, I think these are the marks of civilizations. It's not difficult to understand why, with all the civilizations that came to northern India, some of them very aggressively, that the great faith and face of India still flourish there, right? You can conquer a nation, but you can't conquer the people. And this notion that we are kind of one race, and I think India and America, if you keep the long-term view that it's inevitable that we will have, as free nations, that have this respect for rule of law, this fundamental respect for human dignity, this idea of private ownership and meritocracy at our core, that it's inevitable that we'd be together. Now, all the discussions between now and then become just kind of part of a larger understanding that we're family. So I think the legislative agenda, there may be some tactical things that America is now, as we change our leadership every 4 years or sustain it, you get more drive in different areas. I think this notion now of regional security and India rising into its role in the Indo-Pacific is a great position from which to build on our relationships, which they talked about extensively upstairs, so I don't want to touch on it, although I have some knowledge of that, having served in PACOM in India. And I think the last thing I would say that Indian Americans can do to influence this is to really strengthen the notion of the exchanges between our students. I really feel when I see young Indians here in Georgetown and Indian Americans, I'd like to see more abroad, obviously, but I think this is the Ghost of Christmas future here, this notion of having an experience in that nation and taking that experience back to your nation, and it just sets in motion these synapses and neurons and ideas that are just terrific. You take ideas from one experience and you see them rise in the other environment. So, but I don't think there's one legislative thing that the relationship hinges on. I don't know if that's what you're asking. No. But I've told MR that I really think that I'd like to see more Indian Americans serving in public service, not just in Congress. I think whether you're a sheriff or whether you're doing pro bono work as an attorney or whether you're leading your community's health outreach as an Indian American doctor, that's where I'd like to see the Indian American diaspora have an influence, is in through our own values really setting a high bar for what it means to be a great American citizen.
And just for way of context, Balan was referring to M.R. Rangaswamy, who is the founder of Diaspora living in California, founded in 2012. Thank you, Balan. Let me turn it over to our panelist, Maya Ajmera. Maya, when we were talking about this event, we discussed that we would touch upon a couple of provocative themes and ideas, and I'm glad that you were completely on board with discussing them in the erudite way that you're known to discuss subjects. But I have one sort of broader question and then one somewhat narrower question. The broader question is about your perception, given your experience being a leader, educator in the science technology space, working with students here in America, immigrants, the whole gamut. What is your perception of the American climate to attract the best? And Suchita actually touched upon this earlier. Your perception of America's ability to still attract the best and the brightest among the young science and technology minds from all over the world, including India. Is that the same as it was, let's say, for example, 5 years ago? Is it improving? Is it deteriorating? What are your thoughts?
Running the Society for Science and the Public, I'm in the business of talent. We're best well known for our world-class science competitions. The National Science Talent Search, the Regeneron Science Talent Search, it was once the Westinghouse Science Talent Search, and then Intel, now Regeneron, and then the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair. And through that work, and I'm an alum of that, is we have an enormous amount of data as to where these young people are going. So I'll just give a quick statistic. This year, the top 40 finalists of the Regeneron Science Talent Search, 18 of them were South Asian Americans. Okay? Of that, the top 10 vying for over $1 million in awards, 4 of them were Indian. Last year, the top winner was a South Asian woman, Indrani Das. Okay. If you go to the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair, which brings 2,000 kids from 80 countries to compete for about $5 million in awards, in the last 4 years, we've had, in the top 3 prizes, we've had 3 Indian Americans. Okay? The 4th largest delegation outside the United States is India coming to compete. Okay? The next is the United States delegation from every single state. I would say about 15 to 20% are Indian. Okay? So we are truly, I think, at the cutting edge of innovation and entrepreneurship with the South Asian, young people in the South Asian community. What is happening, though? There are some things that are happening that I think we need to take notice of. One is, I think there is a chilling effect that has happened in the last year and a half, about whether coming here from India or from other places, if this is the right place to come and for higher education. And I've gotten inside knowledge that, you have to take the TOEFL.
Test of English as a foreign language. Yeah.
Right? That the number of people taking the TOEFL from India has decreased in the past year. And one is, I think, the incredible angst around the H-1B visas. That's one. I think the second is, and we need to come to terms with the issue of divisiveness and racial racism. I think we saw this with what happened in Kansas, of the young South Asian engineer who was shot. I think that has had a very chilling effect. I also think that there was, the whole immigration freeze, which was not really a freeze, but really created a chilling effect. It was a very chilling effect on universities. Whether we realize it or not, over half of the postdocs in many of the research universities are from outside the United States. That's a very big deal to our competitiveness in the United States. So I think there are some things that are going on. I will say one of the things that we are seeing and we're hearing from South Asian students quite a bit is they all want to go to Stanford or Harvard, and God forbid if you go to a place like Georgia Tech, and nothing around Georgia Tech. I love Georgia Tech, but it's a great engineering school. But God, I'm talking about this from being the daughter of Indian immigrants who felt very strongly that their daughter was going to go to the very top school. And so there's been a lot of angst around, we're all incredibly talented, we have the best scores, we should all be getting into the best schools. And what I think one of the things I think as a community we have to come to terms with is that diversity is one of our greatest strengths in this country, and that we need to celebrate that. I think I was very taken today by meeting 2 brilliant young women before the panel for this conference, both Indian, and I just made the presumption that they were from the United States as undergrads here. They're like, no, one was from Jammu Kashmir, and the other is Indian but grew up in Dubai and is here. So think about that the talent pool that we are now, which was not maybe in your day and age or my day and age, that was not our talent pool, But the talent pool today is global. So you're not only looking at the young person from Alabama and from the Stuyvesant High School in New York, but you're also looking at the talent in Jammu Kashmir. And I think that is what makes a university so great. And I think every South Asian American young person in this country is going to find a fantastic institution to attend, because there are many of them in this country. And not to say that Stanford and Harvard are not great institutions, but I want to dispel this extraordinary myth that that's the only two places. Okay, and possibly I've spoken out of turn here, but I'm telling you how I see it in my work now.
As good points, Maya. As the late Tim Russert used to say, there's idiots at Harvard and there's geniuses at the University of Iowa.
And my dad got his PhD at University of Iowa, so.
I did not know that, by the way. I'm not winning brownie points. I'm not trying to win brownie points. One other question for you, Maya, and this is on a somewhat narrower topic, but one that remains controversial in the public perception. We in America like to talk about America as being the land of opportunity. We like to extol its virtues as such to people in other countries. There is economic data that shows that economic mobility here in the US is stagnating in the recent past. And in fact, that perhaps there are some, God forbid, European countries that have overtaken us in that regard. But in that context, I want to talk about education as a pathway for economic mobility and two specific things. Perhaps at opposite ends of the spectrum, but in some ways have the same limiting effect on admissions. One is this notion that is prevalent among several Indian American families here in the US that you can't really tell someone anymore that, we are the land of freedom and opportunity and, economic mobility only because Indian Americans are discriminated against in terms of their admissions into various universities, including the top ones. Because there's so many talented, as you were saying, so many talented young Indian Americans here that automatically in the search for diversity, you are biased against just because you are Indian American, right? That's one. The other, at the other end of the spectrum, which does not apply at all to Indian Americans because by definition Indian Americans are first or second generation immigrants, is the issue of legacy admissions, which also sort of blocks out some spots just based on the fact that, you have a legacy of having donated to that institution or, your father or uncle or grandfather went to, a particular university. So given these perceptions or realities, and I'd like your opinion on whether it is just a myth or a reality, but given nonetheless that these perceptions exist, whether true or false, can we still extol to your friend in India saying that, hey, come here to America, we are the land of opportunity?
So, I can be provocative here. I think I'm going to go back to this piece, is that diversity is a great thing. And are South Asian Americans being discriminated against? So I don't know how many of you read a very provocative piece in the New York Times opinion section by Harold Levy. He is the president of the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. He wrote a very interesting spoke truth to power in the admissions game. And he found out that he's dying of ALS, and he said, I'm telling it the way I see. I'm going to tell what I think. And one of the things he said is, one of the things that is hindering, it's not only South Asians, but it's everybody from gaining admission, is legacy admissions. That 30 to 40% are based on legacy. Whether your uncle, father, grandfather, aunt, mother, whatever, went to that university, he said, get rid of it. Just get rid of it completely. And I actually agree with that. even though I gulp, now that I'm part of that legacy generation, I think about my daughter and I think about the universities I went to, and I was like, well, maybe that'll help in the long. But then I go back and I step back and I think my daughter has the most extraordinary opportunities around, so she's going to be just fine, right? And so I think we have to come from that way that. For us, I think we are now part of that legacy piece. For our parents and us, when we were applying, we were not, okay? I also think this whole idea of the philanthropy piece about where you write what your parents do and how Google now has opened the knowledge base of you can find out what your parent does and what they did and how much they're worth. Really plays into, I think, into the admissions. And I have one personal anecdote that I know very well of a young student who got into an incredible university. This student was a fine student, but I don't believe was at the level that should have gotten that admission. The admission pretty much was based on the last name. So you think, okay, that person got in based on the dollars that might be written in the future, or at present, who knows what back deal channels happen, I don't know. But I would think that just needs to go away. I'll give another example. I actually wrote a letter of recommendation for somebody, brilliant young person, and I know the university admissions people, and they called and they said, is this a development candidate? And my heart...
Development candidate.
Yeah, and my heart fell. I was like, what are you talking about? And it's like, we kind of need to know which slush pile to put it in. And I'm like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. So I just think there needs to be a reckoning around this. And this isn't about whether our kids, South Asians, are being discriminated against. I think there's an unlevel playing field that's happening for all students, okay? And I think that needs to change. So I would really encourage you to read Harold Levy's piece in the New York Times. I really give him credit for speaking truth to power on this.
I want to add just a thought. I'm living this dream now with a little Indian at home that has just going to make her decision on colleges here. And I shared with her a similar thought about what a silly notion it is to think that the institution defines you. You define the institution. Any of these schools that have great engineering programs would be terrific. There's a little bit of the pride and ego that goes into early admission to Stanford, or one of these that every young person seems to aspire to that's of this background. But I think this is a deeper conversation. The larger conversation about diversity, I think all of us as Americans believe in the power and importance of diversity. And we like it especially when it doesn't affect us, right? The moment that it starts to affect us, incidentally in America, you might find this funny, but it's true. In my generation, when we went to college, Indian Americans were Caucasian. There's no set-asides, there's no minority implications, there's none of that. And frankly, I never felt different, so I didn't feel like I was a socially disadvantaged group. It really became into vogue to be Asian American when we discovered that there was some advantage to having a minority status. And it just didn't occur to anybody in my generation to even think that we were disadvantaged. We felt so blessed to be here. But I think this is part of the psyche of not drinking too deeply of the Kool-Aid of the environments we're in. The deeper message here for all of our children is your success is in your hands, whether you go to college or not. How hard you work, the company you keep, the character you possess, your willingness to learn and adapt. These are the things that make for a great life, a successful and happy life. And the more that you attach yourself to the kind of names around you, the less that you really are understanding, your impact. This idea is something I think we have to wrestle with. We're all bringing kids into this world thinking that maybe if they go to the right school that somehow success is guaranteed or happiness is guaranteed. And of course we know all that to be false.
Can I just say one more thing? It's another anecdote, and I think we have to come to terms with the price of universities. It is incredibly expensive to go to school. I'm even talking about in-state tuition at places are now very expensive. And so, an anecdote is, good friends whose daughter has gotten into some very good schools, private institutions around the country, but has gotten a presidential scholarship to get into the Honors College at University of Maryland. And, and very prestigious. And I'm really pushing, do the Honors College, because the parents are both school teachers, and they're Indian, and they don't have those sorts of resources. And even to get aid, you have to be above a certain amount, but it really kills the middle class in this country. So I think, we need to come to terms with that there is, all of us in the South Asian community think we're all well-to-do. I think there is many that are living incredible middle-class lives and also are struggling to make ends meet. And we need to come to terms with that in terms of how we think about our diaspora, because it's not singular anymore.
Good point. Good point. Suchit, you had a point to make.
I think also if you look at, and perhaps this is because of I moved here only a few years ago, so my set of experiences are a little bit more recent in that if you talk to someone that's in 11th or 12th grade in India right now, right, not only has their perception changed, but the perception of their parents has changed, in that academics is not the only route. If you go, especially in the large metropolitan areas, you talk to parents of teenagers, and they're okay, which was never the case, right? When I was growing up, I was not given much choice, right? So, but now, it's like if you want to pursue a career in sport medicine, or you want to pursue a career in drama, or media or literature, and things are sort of humanities. So there's a lot of cultural change that's happening in India, because of which I don't think necessarily that a 17, 18-year-old kid in India has this, singular, goal that is being a doctor or just, getting that visa and coming here. And I think that they're looking at Hong Kong, they're looking at Singapore, they're looking at Australia. And those countries are doing a lot more in terms of outreach. So I think the talent, it's a global village, and I think the talent is getting distributed a little bit more evenly than it was before. So going back to the entrepreneurial part of it, as we look to hire people, right? I don't see that number of Indian Americans coming into the, from a hiring perspective. So when we put out, even in tech, we're seeing a lot of diversity now with a lot of Asian Americans, Koreans, Chinese, especially on the East Coast, we see a lot. So I think America has to up its game in terms of providing, competing with other universities, globally. And I think that has to definitely happen, because it's not so much of an inbound problem anymore.
Good point, Suchit. I'd like to turn to my organizing friends at Georgetown just to ask a question. This has been an incredibly substantive discussion, thanks to our great panelists. I wish we had another hour to talk, but I really do want to open it up to the audience for questions. Do we have the time for that? Okay, so can I just take a few questions? I see one hand here. Please, go ahead.
Mike? Actually, yeah, probably don't need a mic. So I'm probably going to play devil's advocate for Suchit Maya. I am an entrepreneur. I used to be a neuroscientist. I'm in the filmmaking world now, and seeing a couple of startups in the US, one in India. I'm based in Mumbai now. So for the startup ecosystems, you mentioned that there's a lot of work in India and in the US in terms of just entrepreneurial spirit. But I've seen that, the Indian startup ecosystem, there's a huge trust deficit, right? I mean, I was part of a couple of startups in the US, and you sign an NDA or, sign a contract, it's going to work. In India, we're still way behind in terms of just that basic trust. I'm wondering whether business leaders like you or or maybe even the larger Indian diaspora is doing something, probably, educating the Indian Indian startup ecosystem about how entrepreneurship can go to the next level if we have that sort of, basic level of business trust. And then Maya, you emphasize diversity a lot, but given my own experience where, I did a lot of that engineering neuroscience stuff and I'm a filmmaker, I would argue that the biggest American export is really Hollywood, right? And where does Indian diaspora stand there? I don't see a whole lot of that happening. There's a lot of, this is some STEM education going to Stanford, Harvard, whatnot, but, where's that happening? So.
Yeah, on so you're absolutely right that there is a difference, and it's not just India and America, but there's a difference in any geography that you operate, right? So as a company, we operate in Netherlands, in Australia, in India, and in UK, and each one of those geographies are very different. Each one of those geographies have their own challenges. Whether you're an entrepreneur starting your business in India, the US, or Sri Lanka, the role of the entrepreneur is to really adapt to the local environment. When we started our business in India, all of those challenges were there. They still exist. I think that goes to a larger, more systemic issue, which is, and this is my personal opinion, that the role of any government or any leader is to truly inspire, and our governments have never put in inspirational behavior. Banks don't open on time, trains don't work on time. So if that were to happen, I think it would be a cultural change, but it has to come from the very top. And so that's a more systemic issue, but I think companies continue to thrive in that environment. It's just you're in a different type of a petri dish. Your surroundings and your environment is different, but there's an equal amount of opportunity. And I think my point was that the entrepreneurial spirit is perhaps similar, because I think it's more part of our a human expression of trying to change something in a situation. So that's where I come from.
Maya, for you.
And so the whole so there are still barriers to entry, I would say, for in certain industries, and I would suspect Hollywood is not my place, but it is for you, and that is your experience, and I would suspect that's the case. I mean, I would like to, when we just think about our own TV shows that we see, we don't see many South Asian Americans, and the ones that, I grew up in North Carolina, I still have friends who think of Apu and The Simpsons as who we are, which just drives me nuts. So there are barriers to entry, and I think we have to do more in the places. I will say something that I will give great credit to our generation of parents, and I think just everyone, is that road, the fact that you went from being a neuroscientist to a filmmaker is a very cool thing. Absolutely. And, well, but I just want to say, think about the risk-taking and the vision and sort of the interdisciplinary nature of what you've done and now what you're doing. There is much more openness to that risk-taking among our community now than there's ever been before, and that is very heartening.
Before you leave this, though, I just want to say I agree with you. It's probably why you didn't ask me the question. There's no question I couldn't have gone anywhere in the world to get $15 million except Silicon Valley. Sense of the risk, sense of the potential market. Do I believe in this guy? Does he know what he's talking about? Does he have the best technologists? My co-founder is a guy that's the architect of Google Maps. He's got this brilliant cadre of scientists around him, and we convinced these guys in a Shark Tank experience, and it was real. Sign on the dotted line. Here's the responsibilities. It's all on us now to deliver that. And I just can't find. I'm very optimistic about America's role, notwithstanding the concerns I think you heard Maya express about the perceptions of America abroad. When you come here, you find it's a meritocracy. And at the end of the day, if you're willing to work harder and take your licks, right? Learn from your experience. You can adapt and overcome here. Unlike any other place I've experienced on Earth, I've landed on all 7 continents. I've been in every, in the service, in every nation that you can imagine there's a problem in, I've been involved. And I'm telling you, fundamentally because of the rule of law, America is the best place to begin a business, to be responsible, to be accountable, to be both to your community and to your people that you work with and for. And I think India has got such potential in this regard. And you see this entrepreneurial spirit on the streets in India that is so exciting, this commitment to democracy. The orderlies, in 1995 when I landed in India, the orderlies that came with me as an officer, they would wait in line 5 hours in Chennai to vote. And I'd come back to America and I'd see that I'd missed 2 or 3 elections and I was too lazy to fill out the silly absentee ballot, even though here I was watching all of this vibrant democracy unfold. So I'm bullish on both countries for different reasons, but I think you're right. The entrepreneurial spirit is here.
I just wanted to make one point. I think that the point about Indian Americans in media, that's changing so rapidly, though. You look at the people that were newsmakers, Hasan Minhaj, Kumail Nanjiani, Priyanka Chopra. I think that's going to change pretty quickly.
My sincere apologies to the audience. We can get more questions in. We've run out of time, but the panelists are hopefully going to be around for a little bit to chat. Thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it, and thank you for attending. Thanks, Irfan.